let's talk a little bit about the issue of Jewish DNA or Jewish genetics. And this is not something that I was trying to jump into as a Christian apologist, but part of the challenge is whenever you discuss all the important things you want to discuss, a lot of Hebrew Israelites, unfortunately, they want to discuss other things. You know, you trying to discuss the Bible is what I mean. And then they want to discuss genetics. And then if you avoid it, it's like, oh, well, that's because you don't have the truth or something like that.
What do you call it? What do you call it, vocab? Hebrew hopscotch?
I use Hebrew hopscotch a little more particular. It's when they can't stay in a passage. So it's not just their tendency to have ADHD. I have another term for that. I call it ADHD, and I call it attention deficit hue disorder. So no matter what you're talking about, they talk about color, attention deficit hue disorder. But Hebrew hopscotch is where they will not stay in a passage with any depth. They'll read part of a verse and then jump to some other verse without really going through the flow of a passage. Like, I've never seen anyone be able to walk a Hebrews like all the way through Romans 9 through 11 and sit in it, you know? So that's a Hebrew hopscotch idea. So let's talk a little bit about this Jewish DNA and all that. Okay, so for some reason, the Hebrew Israelites have this thought, this attitude that it's not just that they need to be Israelites themselves. They need to be considered Hebrew themselves. For whatever reason, it's like they think that the pie is only so big. And what I mean by that is they have to likewise take away the piece of the pie of most modern claimants to any type of modern Jewish identity. It's not just they want in, they want people out. And it's funny because I hold a covenant theology, which I know everyone doesn't, like GCon doesn't, as far as that kind of progressive covenant theology. However, they'll accuse like someone like me of replacement theology. But Hebrew Israelism is really the ultimate replacement theology. It actually is replacement theology, not just using that as a slur, which is kind of the way they used to describe my position and people like me, because they're literally saying, hey, it ain't none of y'all. It's us, right? And so let's go and look at some issues about some Jewish genetic studies. And I'm going to start with two key studies here. And these are very fascinating studies that were done. I'm going to give you the sources, and then you'll be able to find the links as well for yourself. And this is in relationship to something called the Cohen modal haplotype. Sometimes in the literature, you will see what I'm talking about here abbreviated as CMH, Cohen modal haplotype. And here, I'm going to bring up some Bible verses in a second, so I'm going there right now. Okay, let me have those. I want to have those on deck. Okay, and so here we are looking at two studies. Now, it's estimated that out of 7 million Jewish 50,000.
Do you have? Do you want to share your screen maybe so the people can see it or no?
Not yet. Maybe when I do some other stuff later. So okay. Yeah. Not. I don't have anything necessarily yet. But thank you.
I thought you were just reading something off the internet there.
Well, I have notes, but I don't have like a. I don't have like a PowerPoint. I'm not, and I have like these are my own sort of shorthand notes. Okay. So it wouldn't make sense to most people trying to look at it. But 5%, 7 million Jewish males are considered Kohanim, and that's the plural of Kohen, and that just basically means of the priestly line. It means descended from Aaron, and there's about 350,000 males that have that. So this is passed through the paternal side, you know, the male descendants directly. And there's some stats that will give you lower, like maybe 2 to 3, but it's somewhere in that range, you know, 2 to 5%, which would be about 7 million. And here's how some of that come about. This is very interesting. So previous generations of historians did not really have access to, in a manner speaking, the history book that everybody carries around inside themselves, which is their genes. Historians did not have access to this prior. Now historians who want to talk about some of these questions, asking certain questions about population groups, have access. And this really began, you begin to see this really in the 90s, especially the late 90s. And now you'll find this whenever it's necessary. Historians interacting with genetic evidence, genetic questions. And it's a fascinating thing that's emerged. So the first paper I'm going to refer to that's based upon a study is from Nature, prestigious British journal there, volume 385, January 2nd, 1997. The title of this is Y Chromosomes of Jewish Priests by Michael F. Hammer. He's down there in Tucson, Arizona, which poor Tucson. That's our second biggest city, but it's a sad, dusty town. Carl Skrorecki and Robert Bradman. They took 188 Jewish males, and they contributed genetic samples. They were from England, Israel, and North America. And then they were out also, if they were contributors, they were asked to describe their background, if they were a Kohen, Levi, or an Israelite. And from the analysis of this, they wanted to compare people who describes themselves or thought in some way based upon their last name, for example, like Cohen or Rappaport. They wanted to compare that to other people who were considered to be Jews, compare the non-Cohen with the Cohen. And here's what's fascinating from this first study I'm talking about. Two markers emerged. That's the study. That's it right there. Two markers emerge from analysis of the Y chromosome markers. The first thing was this thing called YAP negative. YAP negative. It stands for Y chromosome allele polymorphism. It's an insert sequence. And since it's YAP negative, that title denotes the absence of it. So it does not have the Y chromosome allele polymorphism insert sequence because it's YAP negative. The second was something that was a microsatellite repeat marker called DYS19. And here's what's fascinating. Out of 98.5, the Cohen remember there was 188 for this particular sample size. 98.5 had YAP, which means which is a fascinating thing, and that's significantly lower than in non-Kohanim. Now, some of that sounds a little confusing. The point is, two things emerged that were different out of the Kohanim population from the larger Jewish population, and things that some had and then things that didn't have. But they weren't going to stop there, right? So more research had to be done. And so there's a second research paper that I'm going to point you to. It's from July 9th, 1998, Nature, volume 394. The title of this is Origins of Old Testament Priests. Origins of Old Testament Priests. This is by Mark Thomas. Again, this man, Carl Skrorecki, Chaim Ben Ami, Tudor Parfit, familiar name a lot of people know, Neil Bradman, and David B. Goldstein. And they found more information. Here's what they found in this. And this one, if you want to show this one on the screen as well, it's Origins of Old Testament Priests, Nature, volume 394, from July 1998. Origins of Old Testament Priests, Nature, volume 394. You should be able to find an abstract of it there. You may have to put a little more information, like put Nature or July 1998, something like that. Let's see what pops up. Or maybe the name. If you put like David Goldstein, Tudor Parfit, I believe I see it. I believe I see it right there. It looks like you see it right there. Yeah, that's what it looks like.
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
so
yeah,
from
okay.
that, here's what
There
they
we go.
found. And, you can look at these. We're showing you what they are. They found a particular array of 6 chromosomal markers. This particular array was in 97 of the 106 Kohanim tested. Now, this is important. I'm gonna stop here for a second to try to explain this. First of all, understand when we talk about the Cohen modal haplotype, sometimes people think, oh, that's like a gene. It's like the gene of Aaron. That's not what it is. It's a combination of neutral mutations that indicate a common lineage. Basically, it's not a Cohen gene. It's not the gene of Aaron. It's the Cohen genetic signature. And what's interesting about it is there are other Jews besides the Kohanim who have it, and Middle Eastern non-Jews who also carry it. So this is somewhat present in some Arab populations. So what does that show? This is really a marker of the ancient Hebrews. Most likely the marker of the shared patriarch. That's why this unique thing is in non-Jews who are of Arab descent as well, because they have a common patriarch there. But it's preserved in higher percentages within Kohanim. And here's why. If you could show on the screen Exodus chapter 40, verse 15.
Yep.
Exodus 40, 15. And again, G-Con, anytime you want to interrupt or cut off, I know you'll be able to follow up. You got all kinds of stuff. But anytime you want to be like, well, let me add something, you can, G-Con. If you,
yeah, for sure.
He's not muted or anything, is he? He's
go ahead, brother.
Okay.
He muted himself.
Okay, I got you. I'll read this while you're going there. I got the ESV up.
Go to 15.
Exodus 40, verse 15. Anoint them. Well, actually, let me start just a tad bit here before here. Sure. Let me start like in verse. Let me start in verse 12. Okay. Then you shall bring Aaron and his sons to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and shall wash them with water, and put on Aaron the holy garments. And you shall anoint him and consecrate him, that he may serve me as priest. Here's the key. You shall bring his sons also and put coats on them, and anoint them as you anointed their father, that they may serve me as priests. And their anointing shall admit them to a perpetual priesthood throughout their generations. Now, stop there for a second. Theologically, to fully have a full grasp of this, because we got to put our Bibles together, old and new, we need to go to the book of Hebrews. Now, we're not going to go there now because that would take us sort of afield. But to understand how does a command or injunction like this function within our current context, which is a new covenant context, right? To understand that, Hebrews is key for that. Okay, it's very key. It literally specifically talks about this issue. But we see the command of Yahweh to Israel here, and it's important. Their anointing shall admit them to a perpetual priesthood. So this is Aaron and his sons. So this is passed on through the male line. And here's also what's fascinating. And we're not done with the results, but an interesting thing that shows is over the centuries, a relatively high rate of fidelity among the Jewish wives, or the wives, whatever they were, of these sons of Aaron, or descendants of Aaron, rather, who a lot of times end up with names indicating that. Now, they don't always, but they do sometimes, and it's fascinating. Sometimes they just have stories passed down from their family. Sometimes they pan out, sometimes they don't, right? That's what the testing here is about. But going back to the second study. But since you got the Bible up, let me show one other verse, because I'm trying to relate the science with why it's relevant. Could you go to Deuteronomy chapter 18? I'm sorry, you got the Bible up. We should probably go to this one other verse. Deuteronomy chapter 18. And
it's okay. I don't mind, bro.
Focus on verse 5, but I'll start reading before you get there. I'm going to start with verse 1, but focus on verse 5. The Levitical priest, all the tribe of Levi, shall have no portion or inheritance with Israel. That's fascinating, by the way, because that's saying that those who are Levites, these are the descendants of Aaron, right? They're not going to have a part of the land. That's interesting because the Hebrew Israelites got Levi in Haiti. They've got them part of the land. Now they might say, well, that's not in Israel, that's in the diaspora. Still, it's just weird. They should be spread out amongst them. You know what I'm saying? They shall eat the Lord's food offerings as their inheritance. They shall have no inheritance among their brothers. The Lord is their inheritance. And by the way, this shows really God's intention. This is really now the portion of all Christians. God is our inheritance through Christ. See, it's a beautiful thing there. Sometimes people miss that, right? And that's fascinating because the Bible says in 1 Peter that now we Christians are priests. From those offering a sacrifice, whether ox or sheep, they shall give to the priest the shoulder and the two cheeks and the stomach. Shoulder of an ox, that's a what is that a ribeye? What is that part? That's a good part to use though for a Philly cheesesteak, by the way, is what I've heard. Okay, the first fruits of your grain, of your wine, and of your oil, the first fleece of your sheep, you shall give him. For the Lord your God has chosen him out of all your tribes to stand and minister in the name of the Lord, him and his son for all time. By the way, notice here again, you actually see God's choosing of Aaron, just like God's choosing of Abraham or Israel. It's not based upon Aaron. I mean, Aaron did all kinds of stuff, and as you're going to see his sons will too. It's based upon God saying, look, this is because I choose this, right? It's very just fascinating to see the way God's grace and is moving with his people. It's a beautiful thing to see. He's a giving God. And if a Levite comes from any of your towns out of all Israel where he lives, and he may come when he desires to the place the Lord will choose, and ministers in the name of the Lord his God, like his fellow Levites to stand and minister before the Lord, then he may have an equal portion deep besides what he receives from the sale of patrimony. Okay, just showing that this is supposed to be a continued thing. And even through the diaspora, it appears that there were still some connection. And really, because the DNA doesn't get really, it doesn't get lost because we're tracing it through the male side. You see what I'm saying? So in theory, going back all the way to Aaron, which we're going to talk about here a little bit more in a second, because it's on the male side strictly. It's paternal, not maternal, that we're discussing here. It's very, very important as well. And you even see today, like in the synagogues, they'll sometimes do something called the priestly blessing. They read, I believe, a portion out of Leviticus, and it's like the split fingers. And some people know this, some people don't. But Leonard Nimoy, who is a Jewish extract, who played Spock in Star Trek, the original series, he improvised that for Spock's character as a Vulcan greeting. He would split apart and say, "Live long and prosper." And if you think about it, the "live long and prosper" line is similar to the Levitical priesthood blessing that the priests actually give. That's where he got it. It's out of his Jewish background. It's a fascinating little tidbit relating to Star Trek that relates out of this issue. It's a very fascinating thing. Now, let's go back, if we could, to that study, because I'm going to be talking about the other things they found from that study, origins of Old Testament priests there, and reiterating that they found a particular array of 6 chromosomal markers that was in 97 of the 106 who were tested. All right, the chances of this are less than 1 in 10,000. And here's what's wild. There's a common set of genetic markers in both Sephardi and Ashkenazi alike when it comes to the Kohanim worldwide. And since it's worldwide, it indicates a common origin predating the split of these two communities, which is said to be around 1000 AD. But here's what's crazy. It's not just Sephardi and Ashkenazi. Now, this is going a little bit outside of the test, what I'm talking about right now. These are subsequent tests. Origins of Old Testament priests. That's the test I'm discussing right now. I don't know if you can put that back on the screen, the abstract of it, so people know what we're discussing. But here's what's wild. They did this later on, and Tudor Parfit was directly related to this, and I could tell the story about that. It's a fascinating thing. They did this later on as well with the Buba clan of the Limba. So the Limba are from South Africa and Zimbabwe. And basically they told Tudor Parfit, hey, they were in South Africa when this happened. Hey, we're also Israelites. We heard you've been working with these different communities and whatever, and hey, we're also, and so come check us out over here. We have oral traditions and you'll believe us. And Tudor Parfit, he's kind of he's like seems like he's like a moderate Anglican, he's not, it's like, really, he's skeptical is my point by saying that. But he goes over there, they end up doing the testing, and it ends up that the identical percentage of by some accounts, identical percentage of those who have this Cohen modal haplotype was present in the male side of the Buba clan, which it ended up being 52%, according to Parfit, 52% on the male, kind of like their priestly class that they had, the Buba clan. So it's out of one of all the groups they had. So it's not all the Limba. Sometimes people talk about the Limba and they're like, well, the Limba. Well, the evidence is there from the Buba clan specifically. That's where the testing has been to my knowledge. I don't know about all the whole larger population of the Limba, but it's within the Buba clan, certainly. And it matches Sephardi and Ashkenazi populations. It's almost unbelievable. So you have these folks who are all over the world, because there was a scattering according to Deuteronomy 33, chapter 30, verse 3, and 2864. That scattering happened. And even though Jews make up less than 1/4% of the world's population, there have been historically almost everywhere, all over the globe. And the fascinating thing is, then they end up having these genetic markers, regardless of the phenotype. And the phenotype is the way you look and can change, because our DNA differences are a very small percentage. We match up, almost every single one of us matches up. The most interesting things, though, there, of course, is in the differences that we have between each other. But it's so small. That's why somebody can look like whatever, basically, and still have these genetic markers underlying. So the Limba look like other Bantu-speaking peoples, relatively speaking. The Ashkenazi look, relatively speaking, like other Eastern Europeans. The Sephardi look, relatively speaking, like other North African Jews and Spaniard Jews. And yet they have these things. And it's not just them. There's another community that's interesting that I'm just learning about today, a much smaller community. Say what?
The Samaritans, Kohanim has it too.
Oh, yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. Can you say a little more something about that? Because I feel like GCon, I feel like the Samaritans get left out of the conversation a lot. I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but thank you so much for bringing that up.
Yeah, so what happens is when you look at the Samaritan, among the Kohen, they realize that whatever group that they're in, whatever Jews that there is, among the Kohen, the priests, they all have this marker, which is a J1C3 marker, or J1, which they call, I think it comes from the J subclad. So then the Samaritans also have J1 and J2 markers. Now these markers originated outside of Africa. So then when you look at, like he said, the Buba tribe, and they have these markers, then you begin to see that they themselves, now it's not necessarily a Jew marker, but what it is it's a marker. It shows that they have close relationships, shared genetics with each other, real close, and it's been consistent, constant. So they can look at the rate between of this mutation that they see, and look at the mutation to say that this can date back, because they believe that it's constant. It can date back to a specific ancestor, the closest ancestor that they had. And so when they did the rate, like you said, it came all the way back to the times of when Aaron and them would have been looked at. And so that's how they're looking at these things. But a lot of these groups that are Jews have this marker, and this is an out of Africa marker. And one of the things that we look at, which we're going to talk about, but I'm going to let them finish, is that a lot of African Americans that say that they basically are Jews or Israelites don't have a lot of out of African markers. And when they do, they have European, like probably R1B or something like that, which European Jews have R1B2, but they also have autosomally traced back to the Middle Eastern, and have mutations at a high level on their chromosomes. And so when you look at what he's saying here is that this is similar with a lot of other Jews. And so if you're saying you're an Israelite, we know geographically certain mutations picked up, certain haplogroups came along, subclads that's outside of Africa, that's in those areas where biblically Israelites would have came from. Why is it that you're saying that you're an Israelite and you're an African American, but you don't have those markers? You don't have none of those markers, and so that's what we're looking at, and what we want to get to later on farther into some studies, especially about the Ashkenazis. But definitely, there's many other groups that also have this marker just as well, J1C3 marker, and which they could name it as the Kohen marker, basically.
Yeah, and again, I'm glad you brought up the Samaritans, because a lot of times they get left out, and it's true they're mixed, if people want to say that, but I mean, everybody is, including the populations we're studying. To kind of put I'm going to go back to that study briefly, but to put a scholar's like response on it, so people can kind of understand. He basically, because I like this scholar, Dr. Harry Oster, he's written a really good book on the topic as well. He has a quote about this, and he has a good book I'd recommend people get. It's called Legacy, A Genetic History of the Jewish People. It's on Oxford. It's a really important book to if you're really trying to get into this. And here's what he says. He's the chairman of the Human Genetics Program at New York University School of Medicine, by the way. Quote, recent work from genetics labs has validated the biblical record of a Semitic people who chose a Jewish way of life several thousand years ago. These observations are the biological equivalent to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, suggesting that despite 2,000 years of diaspora, the relatedness of the Jews of Eastern European, Ashkenazim, North African, Sephardim, and Middle Eastern, Oriental origin can be demonstrated by genetic marker analysis. It's an amazing thing. And just like GCon said, this most recent common ancestor, who it looks like for all intents and purposes is Aaron, dates back as far as sort of the genetic clock that they can kind of use 3,300 years. That's the approximate time. And this is based upon the variation of the mutations among Kohanim today. And then they kind of look at the time frame, and it yields 106 generations away from the most recent common ancestor, that's 3,300 years. That's around the time of the Exodus. So there's somewhat of a margin of error here, but it's actually an interesting apologetic biblical proof, regardless of all the stuff with Hebrew Israelites and all that, because sometimes people are like, well, Moses didn't exist. And well, we have basically genetic evidence for Moses's brother and genetic evidence really ultimately for Abraham himself. Now they'll be like, oh, that's circumstantial unless we can take a sample from Abraham. But the thing is, this is kind of how things like this work when you do this. You know, this is the way it is. And this has been a fascinating thing. And the reason why there's an explosion specifically in Jewish DNA is because of their tendency not to intermarry. Now, what happens is Jews intermarry at a greater rate when persecution is less. But throughout much of their history, persecution is greater. And so this is an important thing because you have sort of this isolated community that's traveling around the globe. There's not a whole lot of people groups that sort of have that shared type of history. It's a fascinating thing. Now, things are changing, and that's why, you know, this research, it's almost like the perfect timing. Things are changing because, especially in the West, you know, Jews, they intermarry, you know what I'm saying? But we can look, and it's a fascinating thing to look. There's other isolated communities that they do this with. The Jews aren't the only one. There's certain communities, and you could talk about them. But this is a very, very fascinating thing because it also has this oral tradition that's not just oral. You know, it's written at this point, a written history that actually corroborates this genetic evidence. It's almost unbelievable, and that's why a lot of the scholars who are involved in this, a lot of them are secular. I don't know if there's any like sort of confessional people, and even the ones who have some kind of faith commitment seem decidedly secular. You know, they buy into evolution and everything else. So they're like constantly being surprised, like, well, I guess maybe this is right. You know, they're constantly being surprised when you listen to lectures and talks, or when you read what they write sort of in their frank moments, you kind of see this constant surprise. But now it's almost just a matter of fact. It's just working out more and more of the details. So back going to this, at the 1999 Jewish Genome Conference in Israel, Professor Hammer, who was involved with the first study that I mentioned, and has been involved a lot with this, he confirmed there the numbers he gave were that 80% of all self-identified coenems share a common set of genetic markers. And we mentioned that it's 6 different things together. So it's sort of a genetic signature. And that's important to understand. And it's just a fascinating thing. This means the line of the coenem is a direct paternal line from Aaron, the very first high priest. That's what it means. And, you know, he mentioned this, the Samaritans, Jikon did. This has also been tested with other populations. I got off track. I wanted to mention them, but I forgot to mention one other group. I had mentioned the Limba and the Buba clan within the Limba, their Plishti class, and how the numbers are very similar there to other populations. But it's also true with these smaller groups. Like there's a small population who has a tradition that they left Israel in 70 AD. They have a kind of a coenem class that's a people group off the island of, I think it's called Derba, DJERBA. It's off the coast of Tunisia, so Northern Africa. They sampled theirs as well. They also had the CMH, that's a colon modal haplotype, and also Jews from Jerusalem's old city as well. So this is fascinating stuff. Now, the other thing I mainly have is kind of leave some of that, and then what I have is sort of reactions by different researchers to this, different geneticists, because I think it's helpful sometimes to say, okay, what are they saying about this? And then I have a little bit on the Khazars, but I'll stop there. I'll probably read some of these reactions if that's okay, but then I'll stop before we get into Khazars, and I have a little bit more on Limba and a couple other things. But I know Jikon's going to do some follow up. But let me show some of these reactions, and some of these you can find in a very accessible book called DNA and Tradition: The Genetic Link to the Ancient Hebrews by Yaakov Kleiman. And I like it. It's very kind of user-friendly, and it leads you to the broader sources if you want to get into them. But let me read some of these. Okay, so we'll start here with Dr. David Goldstein. He's a molecular geneticist at Oxford, okay? And here's what he says. And I got all the links and sources if anybody wants. Quote, "It looks like this chromosomal type was a constituent of the ancestral Hebrew population. It was incredibly exciting to find something that could be tracing paternally inherited traits over 100 generations, 3,000 or 4,000 years of history," end quote. And then here is another guy. Let me get his credentials up here. Carl Skrorecki. He's the Rappaport Research Institute Director of Nephrology. That's basically a kidney specialist at Rambam Medical Center, Technikon, Israel Institute of Technology. Listen to what he says. Quote, The oral tradition of the priesthood has a DNA or genetic counterpart. The scientific information confirms that the majority of contemporary Jewish males who identify themselves as Kohanim are descended from a common male ancestor who founded a patrilineal dynasty consistent with the tradition of the Jewish priesthood. It's almost equivalent to finding a remnant of the garb of the first priest's family, as if you went to the Sinai and found some remnant of Aaron's anointment ceremony. And then he says this: the simplest, most straightforward explanation is that these men have the Y chromosome of Aaron. The study suggests that a 3,000-year-old tradition is correct and has a biological counterpart. This is so amazing when you look at it. Here's Professor Michael Hammer. Here's what he says about it. Quote, at first I was worried that it was a sampling artifact, a chance result of the group chosen because of the high frequency. So what he's saying is he thought it was a mistake because it seemed impossible that this could be right. He thought there was an error, right? It was incredibly exciting to find something that could be tracing paternally inherited traits over 50 or more generations, 3,000 to 4,000 years of history. This is the first time ever we have been able to make a correlation with an ethnographic record over this time scale. Some people keep records that go back 3, maybe 4 generations, but 50 or more generations. It's a beautiful example of how father to son transmission of 2 things, one genetic, one cultural, gives you the same picture. That's amazing. And then I got like 3 more quotes that are all from Dr. Neil Bradman. He was one of the principal researchers on some of these studies. And listen to what he says. The Kohanim should all have the same Y chromosome if they come from an original source or a single individual. And so essentially that's kind of the hypothesis that was being tested by these guys. I must say, I was tending to expect it to come out the other way. So again, he was skeptical. And listen to what he says here about that. The difference between the Kohanim and the Israelites in both the Ashkenazic and the Sephardic population was statistically significant. While we did not detect a statistically significant difference between the Kohanim of the Ashkenazic and the Kohanim of the Sephardic, indicating that this oral tradition seems to have been around for the last 1,000 years. So let me explain what he's saying there. He's saying there's a significant difference between the Kohanim and the rest of the folks who would be described as modern Jews. But between the Kohanim class of Ashkenazi and Sephardic, there's not a statistical big difference. That's amazing. That's saying across basically 2 massively different communities, this one group is very similar. They're more similar to each other, even though they're in 2 different communities, than they are to the rest of the Jews around them. It's almost, again, this is almost unbelievable. Listen to this, what Bradman says here. Work that we're doing on additional Jews in different communities should enable us to get an insight into whether this time can be pushed backwards or not and how the priesthood may or may not have originated, he remarks. What I have to say is that we have not, despite what some newspaper headlines may have said, proved that the Bible was correct, and we have not shown that Aaron did exist. So you see, these guys, again, are skeptical. They're like, we're not proving the Bible right. They want to make sure they want to make sure they're saying that because that's not their goal or mission. You see what I'm saying? But nonetheless, I mean, I think we can see this is clearly corroborative, and they said that. So it's like, okay, why didn't you need to say that? And then one last thing I'm going to read. We've been inundated with people who write to us asking for their Y chromosomes to be tested. Unfortunately, I cannot stamp anybody's Y chromosome to prove anything. This is simply a population study. And so one thing about that is this is the last thing I mentioned. I kind of handed over is Tudor Parfit, who had been involved with some of this. When people started hearing about it, there was a group that had a population off the coast of Papua New Guinea, or is in that area. They had heard about what Tudor Parfit was doing with like the Limba, for example. And so they call him, and then the leader of the community comes to his hotel room, right? And is like, hey, I want you to do us as well, because you're going to see we're Jews as well. And so the community is all excited because they think, ours is going to match up as well. This particular group, there in Papua New Guinea, the results were negative. The way Tudor Parfit put it was, he said, I think he used the phrase zilch, or the word zilch. And it was kind of a tough thing because he had to announce this community. And he said he kind of chickened out. He said, well, the results were inconclusive. We can't say anything for sure. But basically then he said, well, yeah, there is a negative result. Now the community itself still believes the same thing. It has not affected them, in the sense of like, well, they're continuing to go on saying that, but the genetic evidence doesn't match. So it's not like everyone that gets tested, this happens, but it did happen again with Tudor Parfit, interestingly enough, and it's with a small Jewish community there in India, very small, and they're at the bottom of the caste system. And basically, everyone laughs at them because they say they're Jews and they've been mistreated for centuries, and they're basically, you know, pariah, right? And they're like, test us too. Well, they also had the Cohen haplomodal type. It matched up, and so the DNA in that instance exonerated them. And it's kind of an interesting thing. It almost kind of like, okay, their vibe was kind of like, we're suffering for a reason. It's true, you know, we're not just saying it, but it doesn't always work out. Like the most controversial one is probably the Igbo, because that is a rather large group of people, and the DNA evidence has come back as negative. Now, I know the Hebrew Israelites who believe in the Igbo thesis are going to be all upset and you're lying and this and that. But basically, look, I'm not a geneticist, so I'm finding out what they say, and I am in trying to go with the evidence as careful as I can. And
yeah, when majority of them are all saying one thing, because we had someone in the chat say, I don't trust most geneticists. Well, I said, well, when 99% of them are all saying the same thing, you kind of have to listen,
it's like this.
Right?
That's fine if the person doesn't want to trust it, but tell us why. Why don't you trust them? Tell us what. And it's not about just trusting geneticists. It's about these results. And these are teams and groups of people who this is their specialty. They're not dabbling in DNA on the weekend as if you could do such a thing. These are specialists in this area. Yeah. No one is, it's not just an argument from authority. It's saying, look, we have this and now it matches. Let me tell you something though, because it's funny they said that. I'm gonna tell you something. If they did testing, let's say the Hebrew Israelites in North America had some version of the Kohanim, like, oh, look, everyone with the last name of, let's use Laron's last name. Everyone with the last name of Campbell, we've discovered is highly likely to be Kohanim. And let's say that they did testing on Black Americans in North America with the last name of Campbell, right? And they're like, oh my goodness, look at this. It matches up. This is amazing. I guarantee you they would trust those genetic results. Like, oh, look at it. Because they try to do that with the Limba. They'll be like, whenever we talk about genetic, like, well, you haven't mentioned the Limba. And then we talk about the Limba and also how it's irrelevant to most Black Americans because they're in Zimbabwe and South Africa. That's not the West Coast people. That it's not the West Coast, right? And so the point by saying that is this is not a significant factor in who came over in the transatlantic slave trade or who ended up in Western Hemisphere. And so it's like, okay. And also if you verify the Limba, if you're going to use them, you're verifying the Ashkenazi, the Sephardic, and these other populations we've mentioned. It's like it's a catch-22 if they want to do that. But, you know, if any of these guys have ever gotten a battle about, you know, that's not my kid, I guarantee you they'll trust those results. That's sure. Right. If they you know, they know and it turns out that way. You know? But, you know, nonetheless, they'll say that, but that's fine. Tell us the reasons why. Tell us what's wrong there and explain it and things like that. And you know, even with people who get exonerated for crimes they didn't commit because of DNA evidence, we celebrate that. That's a good thing, right? That's sort of 2 or 3 witnesses. One of the witnesses is sort of
that's a good point. Right? You can like convict someone's entire life these days based on DNA evidence. So I mean,
or exonerate them,
Yeah.
And we celebrate that. And I guarantee if these guys have any sense of justice, they celebrate that as well.
Not too many people put into question that DNA evidence in the courts and stuff when it comes to that, right?